Spoiler warning, the following is an in-depth analysis. If you haven't seen this film, you might want to before watching this review. Very few comic book movies have managed to achieve the ambiance and visual presence of The Crow. A movie that, even more than Blade, which I praised for how much it's shot and feels like a comic book, creates such a strong atmosphere that it's easy to get caught up in its world. It's often compared to Batman and Blade Runner in its impressive artistic art direction, and while its subject matter is dark and its world feels bleak, it nevertheless invokes a sense of wonder and is a strangely escapist film. I don't know if it's because the horrible state of the world in this movie makes ours seem tame by comparison, or if it's because it's so exaggerated it's easy to enjoy it rather than be repelled by it. This is a city with no color, a gothic place that's beautiful in a twisted way, and only if you're looking at it on the outside. There are no safe neighborhoods here. Because this is all we see, it seems as if this entire city is the worst parts of Detroit, and we're never given a chance to even consider if there's a world outside of this. Gangs control the streets, commit arson to make land grabs, and they even own some of the apartment buildings people live in. They might be evicted at any moment and violently killed if they don't cooperate. That's what happens to our protagonist, Eric Draven, and his fiancée, Shelley. He's thrown out a window and she's raped and killed on Devil's Night, the night before Halloween, and incidentally, the night before they were to be married. But we're given this scene only in flashbacks, and in fact, we spend no time whatsoever with Eric and his fiancée before Eric is brought back from the dead to avenge his and Shelley's murders. Our first real introduction to him is his digging himself out of his own grave, which sets the sad, solemn tone for the rest of the film. The movie's focus is not on Eric and Shelley's relationship, but rather on the act of violence that destroyed that relationship. And yet, despite the fact that we don't get to know him in life before we see him as a basically undead creature of the night, and even though his only goal is to take the lives of everyone involved in his murder, and quite violently I should add, his characterization is pretty strong, and he becomes a tragic, sympathetic character I truly care for. Even more than Thomas Jane's Punisher, a character whose actions, despite his being wronged, are certainly morally questionable, I find myself rooting for The Crow, even, dare I say, almost condoning his actions. The Crow is a movie that breaks many modern conventions of storytelling, and it's the exception that proves the rule. In both plot and characterization, it goes against a lot of my writer's sensibilities, makes choices I would usually be against as a matter of course, and does it with confidence and authority. That'll be the focus of my analysis. I'll look at why it works despite itself, and of course, I'll examine Eric Draven and whether or not he can really be considered a superhero. It's a fairly simple film that follows the standard formula for a revenge picture. Someone has something taken away from him, and one by one he tracks down and punishes each person responsible. But The Crow has some elements that help it stand apart from the pack. The most obvious is that Eric is dead and brought back to life through the mythos of the Crow, an apparently mystical creature that transcends life and death, that sometimes offers the dead the chance to right wrongs done to them in life. Instead of just avenging his dead fiancé, Eric is also back to avenge his own death. It's even more personal to him than it would be if only Shelley had been killed. Again, this isn't the Punisher, someone who's already in the middle of his path of life, with a wife he's been married to for years and children they've had together. Eric was just starting out. So far, his life had consisted of growing up, playing guitar, trying to make it in the slums, and dating Shelley. He was about to start a new life, and it was taken from him before he even had it. Usually in a revenge plot, the moral dilemma centers on what the person's life will turn into once they've gotten retribution against who's wronged them. In Batman Forever, Bruce implores Dick not to murder Two-Face, who murdered Dick's parents, because it won't bring him peace. He says that vengeance will become his whole life. What I find most interesting about this film is how that element doesn't and can't come into play. Eric isn't Al Simmons, Spawn. He hasn't been reborn to live a second life. Spawn may be an undead creature, but he still has to live on Earth with the consequences of his actions. Eric's situation is extremely unusual, and yet somehow very human, while at the same time, it's a situation no real person will probably ever be confronted with. Put yourself in these two situations for a moment. Number one, you're a mortal human being. A gang has murdered the person you care most about in the whole world. You feel like you've lost everything. All you want is to see every person responsible suffer horribly. Nothing anyone says can calm your rage. You're brought perpetually to a primal place, a place where consequences don't matter. You don't care about your own future anymore, a future you know will be filled with chaos and violence if you allow yourself to go down this road. You don't care about jail time. You might not even care whether you live or die. All that matters is killing those who wronged you. But as driven as you are to do this, there's another voice in your head that says that killing is always wrong. Murdering them won't bring back the person who was close to you. Given time, though you may never truly get past your pain, you could learn to accept it. You still have a future, and the person you loved would want you to experience a full life, not a life wasted avenging their death. Even if you decided those murderers were getting just what they deserved, if you went through with it, a part of you would always be guilty. You'd know you could have been something better, and you would have surrendered to the darkest part of yourself. Okay, now forget all of that. Number 2, now you're Eric Draven. You and your fiancé were both murdered a year ago. You claw yourself out of your own grave. At first, you don't know who or what you are, but slowly you begin to piece everything together as you see and touch familiar places and objects. You realize you're not quite human anymore. Nothing can hurt you. You're invincible. You can see through the crow's eyes. You then realize you're here for a specific purpose, and you won't go back to the afterlife until you've completed it. A much higher authority than man's has given you the opportunity to put things right. The universe wants a balance, and right now there are no consequences for the bad guys, thugs who murder and rape senselessly just for the fun of it. These men barely qualify as human beings. So you hunt and kill each man who had a hand in killing you, and then you return to the afterlife. Justice, according to whatever higher power in the universe that temporarily brought you back, has been satisfied. Now, I doubt that most people would argue with me when I said that the person in the first situation is choosing to be something worse than he could be. In a movie like Law-Abiding Citizen, we might understand and even root for the protagonist as he violently kills. These people are often presented as being justified to some degree, but then we have to ask ourselves if that's what we would do. And I don't think most of us would. As an audience watching a movie, we like to see the bad guys get what's coming to them, but in real life, it's hard to condone a vigilante taking the law into his own hands. But is The Crow an exception? This movie presents Eric as completely justified. The nature of the universe itself seems to be on his side, inviting him to use supernatural gifts to slaughter his enemies. It's a bizarre, extenuating circumstance, something that would obviously never happen in the real world, but if it did, I think I would be like Sergeant Albrecht, who, once he discovers who and what the Crow is, allows him to kill his killers, and even helps him in small ways. If I were Frank Castle, I don't think I would do what he did when his family was killed. But if I were Eric Draven, I really think I would. Also consider that this is a more fantastic world than The Punishers. The situation becomes real because it's presented in such a way where it's easy to suspend our disbelief. We're not given long-winded explanations about how and why the mythos works like in Spawn. It's shrouded in mystery. This is just the way this world works and we don't know why, but I find it plausible here because in this ultra-stylized and violent universe, it's easy to see why the fate of the cosmos would step in to balance out good and evil. We're given an extreme example of the classic lesson that all bad deeds come with consequences. Since these terrible people never get what's coming to them naturally, it has to come supernaturally. Throughout this series, I've explored the idea of the superhero and studied how that concept applies to various protagonists in these movies. Must a superhero have powers? Is a superhero still a superhero if he kills? Can one be a superhero if he hangs up his cape after one adventure? Etc. I've even often been questioned about the appropriateness of some of the movies I've reviewed based on various opinions of whether or not certain characters are superheroes. Movies like The Mask and Dick Tracy, though I had other reasons to include those in the series, which I explained in those reviews. And I find myself on the fence about whether or not The Crow is a superhero more than those others. On the one hand, the creator and writer of the graphic novel, James O'Barr, doesn't seem to consider him a superhero, nor did Brandon Lee in their interviews for the making-of featurette made during the film's production. His primary motive is revenge, but as I said earlier, it's also a mission given to him by a higher power. The rules of his return to Earth are left mostly ambiguous. Because he doesn't fight his mission, we don't know what would happen to him if he failed to kill any of his 4 murderers, or if he refused to do so. He's only back for 2 days before he returns to the grave. Now, is that a time limit, or is he compelled to go back whenever his goal is completed? Could he have stayed 2 weeks if it took that long? And perhaps I'm missing something. But I didn't catch any sort of exposition about this, and I should also point out this isn't a movie with a lot of exposition. The blanks aren't all filled in, and according to the producers, the story here is in fact more cohesive than the comic is, which I haven't read. Eric's Crow vision and his affinity for rock music feel like essential elements in the film, but neither was in the source material. And it isn't a problem that we're not told exactly how the afterlife works. How could we be without an absurd talking crow or an old mentor character like Spawn's Cagliostro to feed us exposition? The mythos is a storytelling device instead of the meat of the story, and its ambiguity enhances the mysterious ambiance. But the problem remains that we don't know if Eric could go against his mission if he wanted to. He's destroying evil, and we can be sure that without 1010, Funboy, T-Bird, Skank, and Top Dollar terrorizing the city, the world is a better place by the end. So good is accomplished, even though his motivation is retribution and perhaps supernatural coercion. We also know that he does make personal choices along the way, that he isn't a zombie and his actions aren't completely controlled by some other force. He only kills those directly responsible for his death. He doesn't kill but does brutalize Gideon, the owner of a pawn shop who pawns the stolen possessions of people killed by the gang. Eric throws engagement rings at Gideon after he's found the one that was stolen from Shelley, saying each of them is a life he helped destroy. And he burns Gideon's shop to the ground. Poetic justice after all the buildings the gang has burned down and after Gideon has profited from that. But he doesn't murder him. Later, when he kills Funboy, who was involved in his murder, he doesn't kill Darla, who serves the gang drinks at the bar and who has been sleeping around with and doing drugs with Funboy. She has all but abandoned her daughter Sarah, forcing her to fend for herself and find food on the dangerous streets while she wastes her life away shooting up with criminals. While they were alive, Eric and Shelley looked after Sarah and tried to keep her safe, and it seems like Darla didn't even know them. So when he confronts her, Eric takes a needle away from her, and just before he kills Funboy, he simply says, "Morphine is bad for you." And that begins to wake Darla up. The next day, she's at home and cooks her daughter eggs in a really emotional scene. Sarah's confused and doesn't trust her mother. She defiantly says she doesn't like eggs, and that's enough to make Darla nearly give up. She says she's never been any good at this mother crap, replace that with the more powerful expletive, and Sarah stops her. She says, "Over easy," and the beginnings of a real relationship form. And at the end of the film, when Eric is ready to go back to the afterlife, Sarah's kidnapped by the leader of the gang, Top Dollar, and his right-hand man, Grange, played by the delightfully creepy Tony Todd. Again, Eric makes a personal choice, and he tries to save her even after discovering that he's lost his invulnerability and can be hurt like a human. I'm confused, by the way, as to why his other powers still work when he's lost that, presumably because he's fulfilled his mission. He still has his crow vision, and he's able to use his touch telepathy to dump the 30 hours of Shelley's pain, which he got from Albrecht, who stayed with her all that time, into Top Dollar. That's where, for me, the mythos is a little too ambiguous, as the script can conveniently choose what powers he keeps and which he doesn't for the purpose of the climax. At any rate, regardless of whether he has the choice to avenge or not to avenge his murder, Eric obviously has free will in other areas, and he does heroic things. He's perhaps not a hero just because he kills bad people. I made the case that The Punisher isn't exactly a hero when I reviewed that film. But he helped save Sarah's relationship with her mother, and then in the end, he saved her life. And he has superpowers. So at least by the dictionary definition, he seems to be a hero with powers. So I'm not sure, but I'm not going to argue with anyone who wants to classify him as a superhero. The other major area where this film is breaking rules and it works is that it has completely one-dimensional villains, and they have to be that way. I'm usually turned off by bad guys with no humanity, people who just do bad things because the story's too lazy to make them real people with backgrounds and motivations that lead them to become who they are. If these slumlords were humanized at all, Eric wouldn't be at all justified in what he does. Again, he's in a very unusual situation. These people had decided to live lives without consequences. They murder and commit arson because it's fun, and that's stated over and over again in their scenes together. Sure, they are out to make a profit, but that's only to keep their brand of fun alive. We don't know what leads each of these men to have such a sick disregard for life. It really feels like, whatever their backgrounds, they've made the concrete decision that life doesn't matter, and they're just going to revel in violence until they die. They're barely human. And partly why this doesn't bother me like it would in another movie is that their boss, Top Dollar, really isn't that way. Sure, we don't get a lot of background for him either, but he at least has passion and purpose. He sees arson like an art. He started burning buildings on Devil's Night because it hadn't been done before. He sees himself as a criminal innovator. It doesn't make him likable, but he's certainly interesting. And that passion turns him into something more than his minions. There's a good juxtaposition between him and Eric, and I'm a sucker for the two sides of the same coin motif. Eric is passionate about music and life. Top Dollar is passionate about fire and death. And when they finally meet at the end, Top Dollar has respect for Eric because of his passion, because of his originality, because unlike his simple-minded minions, he makes things interesting. Top Dollar doesn't want to keep doing the same thing every Devil's Night anymore, because other gangs in the city have started copying him, and his gang is becoming unnoticed. His minions don't get that. They think just the act of setting fires, looting, and killing is fun. They don't have a sense of the bigger picture, no aspiration for greatness. Top Dollar is like a twisted drug lord version of Jack Skellington. For him, seeing Eric in action is like visiting Christmastown for the first time. It's a very cohesive piece. There's no scene without a purpose, and I really like how it's conceived so that each character is related to what happened to Eric and Shelley rather than being archetypes to fit in a standard comic book formula. Sure, you've got the girl who gets kidnapped, though she's not a love interest, and you've got the mob boss who has to be stopped by the end, and you've got the Gordon-type allied cop who's the only one who trusts the hero and puts his own career in jeopardy to help him. But they don't conveniently line up so we can have a story. These characters all play a role in Eric's life a year ago. Sergeant Albrecht is especially interesting, the cop who spent the entire 30 hours with Shelley as she died. Shelley represents the life that was taken away from Eric, and Albrecht tries to take it upon himself to take up the most important parts of Eric's life. He's not allowed to keep looking into the case of his murder, and he's demoted because of it, but he tries, and he takes care of Sarah in Eric's place. Eric and Albrecht have a deep connection and a fantastic chemistry. One of the best scenes in the film is when Eric goes to Albrecht's apartment and touches him, reliving the hours before Shelley's death and thanking him for being there with her. And Sarah represents the future of this city, a child caught between good and evil. Her only positive influence is Eric and Shelley, and then Albrecht, and because he knows he can't stay, Eric distances himself from her when he returns. Even when he's back, she's still mostly alone, before her mother begins to sober up. If Eric never came back, it's entirely possible that, without a real parent, she might have turned into her mother, losing all passion and love for life and wasting away in drugs and crime until her inevitable demise. Again, I love her scene in the kitchen with her mother. In that split second, we see her make the choice that will define her whole life. She's not going to let the city consume her. There's more to life than this. As bleak as the movie looks, its message is extremely optimistic. It's spelled out at the end with Sarah's narration when she says, if the people we love are stolen from us, the way to have them live on is to never stop loving them. Buildings burn, people die, but real love is forever. I do kind of resist this being spelled out, though I do really like the line, and perhaps it's a little easier to swallow here than in other movies, as the story is so well told that it feels like a restatement, an affirmation of what we already know, rather than the way the theme is spelled out at the end of Darkman, where the plot is a little more muddled and it's more there to make sure we know it's trying to tell us something. I've never seen the message of love transcends all done in such an unsappy way, the idea being that as much as a nightmare as this place seems to be, there are good, precious things here, things that don't last forever and will lose ourselves if we forget them. Much stronger than Sarah's closing line is when Eric in the third act takes a cigarette away from Albrecht and says, "Believe me, nothing is trivial." We get some wonderful subtle moments of Eric experiencing joy and realizing how much he took for granted in his life, like when he uncontrollably begins laughing when he sees a bunch of kids running down the street in Halloween costumes. And there's a very poignant, recurring line that we're told comes from a song Eric wrote when he was alive. It can't rain all the time. No matter how bad things get, good things still happen, and they're to be cherished. For an Avenger of Death, Eric is made very real. He's so interesting and such a thoughtful character. I love how his music is subtly made such an integral part to the film, without anyone coming out and saying Eric was in a band or showing us flashbacks of him playing concerts. We're told a lot about him and Shelley through quick flashes, but also by items in Eric's attic that he cherishes. And that set has such atmosphere. It's nearly an iconic setting now. We're not told why he paints his face, we just see him become inspired by the mask that holds a deep meaning for him and his relationship with Shelley, and it seems so natural when he does it. I think it's a symbol to remind him not only of what he's lost, but that he's distanced from this world. He's painted a perpetual sad face on himself because he's defined by his tragedy and he knows that he's still dead, and it brilliantly goes along with the theme of rock and roll. The soundtrack in the film becomes a character all its own, a blending of classical with occasional rock guitar that accentuates Eric's deep sadness and the overall gothic mood of the film. And there are a lot of literary inspirations for the film, of course. There's a lot of Edgar Allan Poe, like when Eric quotes from The Raven at the pawn shop, and even his last name, Draven, and even Milton. And the movie was inspired by late 80s, early 90s rock music like The Cure. Their song Burn is the main theme of the film. This seamless blend of culture spanning the centuries gives it a very timeless feel, and it absolutely holds up today. Famously, Brandon Lee, like his father Bruce Lee, died early in his career, and he was killed during the making of this film. The flashback showing Eric and Shelley's murder was saved for the end of the shoot, since it's really the only time he's not wearing makeup. And he was accidentally shot during that scene with a live round that, unknown to the crew, was lodged in the barrel of the gun between blanks. This movie had a lot of strange luck, both good and bad, during its production. Originally, it was supposed to be a direct-to-video movie, and Paramount was considering releasing it in theaters. They opted out of the project after Lee's death due to controversy over the movie's violence, considering the way Lee died, and when Miramax picked it up, they added another $8 million to the film, bringing its budget to only $15 million in order to complete it. It's incredible the movie was finally released, and probably a relief to all involved that it was a success. A brilliant actor lost his life making a movie he clearly understood and believed in. It's ironic that he died making a film not just about death, but about examining your life to see if you lived it to its fullest. I can't imagine the esoteric notions Brandon Lee's mind must have been filled with just before his death being the last things on your mind before you die. Some viewers have pointed out similarities between Lee's performance and Heath Ledger's performance as the Joker, especially in physical mannerisms, and if Heath Ledger did use this as any inspiration, it's ironic too that The Dark Knight was his last film. Lee delivered an incredibly layered performance, and we're fortunate to have had the opportunity to experience it. I'm going to give The Crow a 4 out of 4.
Love what you've done with the place.